In 1883, the dilapidated town of Fort Hardy, Wyoming, was not just a collection of shacks and barns in the middle of a dusty wasteland. It was a land where every stone could hold a secret, and every person, a scar from the struggle for survival. The local sheriff, stern, with a weathered face, like old leather and squinted eyes that hid the glints of dozens of dramas he had witnessed, held this godforsaken corner firmly in his grasp. His power was absolute, and his word was law, especially when it came to those who found themselves in his town without a penny and without hope. Evelyn Jones, a 16-year-old girl whose raven black hair sharply contrasted with her sun-yellowed skin, learned this cruel reality firsthand. Her story was etched onto her fragile soul like a brand. Her work-worn, cracked hands and deep wrinkles around her eyes betrayed far more years than she actually possessed. A barely noticeable bruise marked her slender neck. Just 3 months prior, she had arrived in Fort Hardy with her parents, refugees from drought-ravaged Idaho. The hope for a new life quickly evaporated when her father, consumed by despair, gambled away their last savings and vanished, abandoning her and her mother. A week later, Evelyn's mother, unable to endure hunger and humiliation, quietly passed away in her sleep, leaving the girl utterly alone. Evelyn was left without shelter, food, or money. Fort Hardy, which initially seemed like salvation, turned into a gilded cage for her. The sheriff, whose name was known to all as Clayton Stone, a man with a stern jaw and piercing eyes, cold as a winter morning in the mountains, sentenced her to public works. This, in reality, meant slavery under the guise of law. Every day from dawn till dusk, she toiled in the local laundry, where her hands blistered from caustic soap and boiling water. Her back ached from endless bending over the wash tub, and her voice grew hoarse from trying to sing, attempting to drown out the monotony and pain. The sword of Damocles constantly hung over her, a debt of $30 that the sheriff graciously recorded in her name for provided lodging and food. Every cent she earned went to Clayton, and the debt seemed to never diminish. She was trapped, and with each passing day, the noose around her neck tightened. Her only solace was an old, battered Bible her mother had given her before she died. Tucked between its faded pages was a dried sprig of cherry blossom, a reminder of home and of a time when her life had been different. Evelyn read it at night by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, trying to find comfort in its words. She felt like a tiny grain of sand, lost in an endless desert, but the flame of hope, however faint, still flickered in her heart. One day, as Evelyn carried a basin of wet laundry down the dusty street, she stumbled over an exposed root and fell. The laundry scattered across the ground, and the basin clattered away. She immediately felt a sharp pain in her ankle. Looking up, she saw the sheriff approaching. His face, usually unperturbed, was now contorted with fury. Clayton, his voice boomed like thunder. "What is this mischief? Evelyn, are you going to damage property for me too? Do you even know how much that basin costs?" Evelyn cowered. She knew punishment awaited her for this. Her eyes filled with tears. "Evelyn," her voice trembled, "forgive me, Sheriff. I didn't mean to. I just..." Before she could finish, the sheriff grabbed her arm and yanked it so hard she felt a bone crunch. Clayton sharply silenced. "Another word, and I'll tie you to the stocks so you learn how to work." At that moment, as if from nowhere, a tall, broad-shouldered man appeared. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was serious, but his eyes held an extraordinary kindness. He was dressed in a worn but sturdy leather jacket and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow, giving him the look of a true man of the West. This was Jonathan Reed, a well-known rancher in the area, owner of the Silver Creek Ranch, located a couple of days' journey from Fort Hardy. He was around 45. His grizzled beard lent wisdom to his face, and his strong hands, accustomed to hard labor, spoke of his strength. He was known for his honest character and for never ignoring someone else's trouble. "Jonathan," his voice was calm but firm, "Sheriff, I think you've gone too far. This is a child." Clayton turned to Jonathan, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to anyone interfering in his affairs. Clayton, through gritted teeth, "Jonathan Reed, what brings you here?" "None of your business, rancher. I am the law here, and I'll deal with my debtors myself." Jonathan, without changing his tone, "I don't see a criminal here, Sheriff. I see a girl who needs help. And it seems to me, her debt to you is not quite what you call law." Clayton's jawline tightened. He hated being told what to do, but Jonathan Reed was not one to be intimidated. Clayton mockingly, "Oh, so you want to save her, you? A childless old bachelor, What will you do with her? She's nothing but a burden. Those words hit like a blow. Jonathan, known for his secretive nature, rarely spoke of his personal tragedy, the infertility that had ruined his marriage many years ago. But now, he didn't let emotion get the better of him. He pulled a pouch of gold from his pocket. Jonathan pouring several gold coins onto the ground. How much did you say her debt was? $30. Here. And another 20 on top, for emotional damages. Give her her belongings, and let her come with me. Clayton looked at the gold in surprise, then at Jonathan. $50 was a lot of money. He had never expected such generosity. His greed overcame his anger. He bent down to collect the coins. Clayton grunted, fine, take your burden. But if I see her around here again. Jonathan didn't listen. He helped Evelyn to her feet. The girl could barely stand. Her ankle was swollen, and a bruise was already forming on her arm where the sheriff had grabbed her. In her eyes, as she looked at Jonathan, there was a mix of disbelief and hope. She didn't know who this man was, but his act was like a breath of fresh air in a suffocating dungeon for her. The journey from Fort Hardy to Jonathan Reed's ranch, Silver Creek, seemed an endless trial for Evelyn, though it actually only took 2 days. Every jolt of the wagon on the bumpy road echoed with sharp pain in her swollen ankle and a throbbing ache in her bruised arm. The cold Wyoming wind, chilling her to the bone even through her thin, worn dress, seemed to drain the last remnants of warmth from her exhausted body. But physical pain was only an echo of the deep, known sorrow that squeezed her chest. Her thoughts constantly returned to the dirty walls of the laundry, to the acrid smell of soap, to the cold voice of Sheriff Clayton Stone, who had promised her nothing but endless torment. She clutched the Bible in her hands, her fingers tracing the dried cherry blossom branch, the only thing connecting her to the lost world of childhood and her mother. Jonathan Reed rode beside her on his dark horse, a large, muscular animal with intelligent eyes that easily handled the rugged terrain. His silence was heavy, but not hostile. Sometimes he cast quick glances at Evelyn, full of some hidden sadness she couldn't comprehend. He offered her his flask of water, handed her a piece of jerky when they stopped for brief rests. These gestures were made without words, almost unconsciously. But for Evelyn, accustomed to every act of kindness turning into a trap, they were a source of deep distrust. She merely nodded in response, her voice refusing to obey, fearing that any sound might shatter this fragile, incomprehensible salvation. Inside, she waited for a trick, a new, insidious way to make her pay for the help rendered. 16 years of life had taught her that selflessness did not exist. Jonathan, in turn, rode absorbed in his thoughts. He saw in the thin, frightened girl not just a victim of Clayton Stone, but a reflection of his own old loss. His infertility, the cause of his divorce and his beloved wife's departure years ago, had left the same gaping void in his soul as in Evelyn's. He understood her silence, her weariness. He didn't need children to realize he was powerless to change this world, but he was strong enough to save at least one fragile soul. By the evening of the second day, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery orange and crimson hues, the outlines of Silver Creek Ranch appeared. It wasn't just a few buildings, but an entire complex, a large log house, several barns and corrals, a windmill whose blade slowly turned against the sunset. The ranch was nestled in a small valley, surrounded by low hills covered with sparse brush and pines. The air here was clean and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As they approached the house, an elderly, stocky man with a thick gray mustache and kind, perceptive eyes emerged from it. This was Silas, Jonathan's old friend and his ever-present foreman. He cast a questioning glance at Jonathan, then at Evelyn, but said nothing, merely nodding. Silas's voice was hoarse, but friendly. Jonathan, you've strayed far this time. What? Saving someone again? Jonathan merely smiled faintly. Jonathan, his voice was tired but calm. Take the wagon to the barn, Silas, and prepare a room for our new assistant, Evelyn. This is Silas. He runs everything here when I'm gone. Evelyn felt her cheeks flush. Assistant. The word brought a mix of relief and shame. Relief that she wasn't being thrown out, and shame that she was again condemned to humiliating labor. Jonathan helped her alight from the wagon. Each step brought pain. He noticed this but said nothing, merely supporting her arm gently. Inside, the house was warm and cozy. The hearth glowed, casting whimsical shadows on the dark wooden walls. Books lined the shelves, and hunting trophies, deer antlers, wolf pelts, hung on the walls. Everything suggested that a true man lived here, Accustomed to solitude, but not devoid of comfort, Jonathan pointed to a small room in the corner. "Jonathan, simply this is your room. Make yourself at home. I'll bring water for a bath, and Silas will bring you some food." Evelyn entered the room. It was small but clean. In the corner stood a bed, covered with a simple but warm blanket. Next to the bed was a small table and a chair. The window offered a view of the endless prairie. She almost cried. How many months had it been since she had seen a clean bed, felt warmth and peace? It was too much. After taking a warm bath that washed away not only the dirt of the road, but also some of the invisible grime that had clung to her in Fort Hardy, Evelyn felt a little better. Silas brought her a plate of hot stew with vegetables and a mug of fresh milk. The food was simple, but incredibly delicious. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and for the first time in a long while, felt a life-giving warmth spread through her veins. Jonathan entered the room after dinner. He sat on a chair opposite her, his gaze scrutinizing but without judgment. "Jonathan, softly, how do you feel?" "Your leg." Evelyn, her voice was still hoarse. "Better. Thank you for everything." She wanted to say more, but words caught in her throat. She still couldn't believe this man had saved her, asking for nothing in return. Jonathan nodded. "Jonathan, you need to rest tomorrow. And then we'll see what you can do. There's always work here for those who aren't afraid of it." These words both calmed and frightened her. She was ready to work, but what if she failed? What if Jonathan became disappointed in her, like everyone else? She looked at her chapped, calloused hands. They were proof of her diligence, but also the brand of her humiliation. That night, lying in the warm bed, Evelyn again took out the Bible. She read it by the light of the kerosene lamp, searching for answers. The lines about mercy and redemption seemed distant, almost unreal. She felt lost, abandoned, but somewhere deep inside, through the thick despair, a thin sprout of hope pushed through. Hope that this place, this man, could become a real home for her. But fear was stronger. Fear of being rejected again, broken again. She hugged the Bible to her chest, like her only friend, and quietly cried. Her tears were bitter as her life had been. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing she knew for sure: she would never let herself be broken again. Silver Creek Ranch, though it offered shelter and food, wasn't an instant haven for Evelyn. The first weeks were filled with a quiet, exhausting struggle. Her physical wounds healed slower than she expected. Her ankle ached with every movement, and the bruise on her arm lingered. But the invisible wounds were much harder to mend. Every day, waking in her small but clean room, she felt the suffocating anticipation of another trial. The habit of constant threat, of shouts and humiliations in Fort Hardy, was deeply ingrained in her mind. She couldn't relax, constantly expecting a catch, another blow from fate. Her duties on the ranch involved household chores, cooking, cleaning, laundry. The work was hard, but different from the Fort Hardy laundry. Here, there was no caustic soap that corroded the skin, or the exhausting standing over a boiling vat. However, for Evelyn, accustomed to city bustle and conventions, life on the ranch was full of unfamiliar challenges. The huge piles of dirty clothes after working in the cattle yard, the need to cook for 3 men: Jonathan, Silas, and another young cowboy named Jake, who spent most of his day on the pastures. Maintaining cleanliness in a large house where dust from the prairie constantly drifted in. All of this required strength and skills she didn't possess. Her culinary abilities were limited to simple dishes, and hand-washing laundry seemed an endless battle with dirt and stains. Each time she failed at a task, panic seized her. She expected reproaches, punishment, but instead, Jonathan and Silas merely watched her silently, sometimes offering help or delicate advice. Jonathan Reed, with his weathered face and deep, sadness-hidden eyes, remained a man of few words. He rarely spoke to Evelyn directly, but she felt his presence, his attentive gaze. He often sat on the porch, watching her as she hung laundry or cleaned vegetables. She saw him work with horses for hours, his strong hands skillfully handling a lasso and harness. Sometimes he brought her small things from town: a sugar cube, a hair ribbon, a fresh apple. These gifts were as silent as Jonathan himself, but for Evelyn, they were a kind of test. She didn't understand why he did it, and this misunderstanding amplified her anxiety. Was he expecting something in return? What was the true price of his kindness? Silas, the old foreman, was more open, though no less reserved. His gray mustache twitched when he chuckled, seeing Evelyn struggle with unruly dough or try to light the stove. He gave her practical advice, showing her how to properly butcher meat, how to care for chickens, how to distinguish good seeds from bad. Silas hoarsely, but with a hint of kindness, don't yank at that stove, girl. She's got character. She needs a gentle hand, like any good horse. Here, watch. Evelyn learned, absorbing every word, but her inner wall didn't crumble. She continued to keep her distance, her dark eyes watching the world warily. At night, when everyone was asleep, she took out her Bible, her fingers tracing the faded pages. The dried cherry blossom, a symbol of her past, now seemed even more distant. She felt like a puppet in the hands of fate, which now lifted her to the heights of hope, now cast her into the abyss of despair. The beginning of spring brought not only greenery, but also unexpected trouble. A severe thunderstorm broke out during the night. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rain lashed against the roofs, and lightning tore through the sky. Evelyn, trembling with fear, hid under her blanket, but the noise outside was deafening. At some point, there was a loud crack, and then a prolonged creak, as if something huge was collapsing. She rushed out of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. Jonathan and Silas were already on their feet. The windmill, their main water source, was damaged. One of its blades had broken, and the mechanism was jammed. Jonathan, his voice was strained. A storm. Just our luck. We won't last long without water. We'll have to go to town for parts. Evelyn, her voice trembled. Can I help somehow? Jonathan and Silas exchanged glances. What could a 16-year-old girl do? Silas, with a sigh, better stay in the house, girl, and look after the livestock. If anything, we'll sort this out. These words were the final straw for Evelyn. She felt useless, a burden. Like a child, she was sent to wait in safety while the men risked their lives and property. Despair engulfed her with renewed force. Her whole being cried out, "You're good for nothing. You'll be on the streets again." She leaned against the cold wall, her eyes filled with tears. She watched Jonathan and Silas, despite the raging storm, bravely walk towards the windmill, their figures disappearing into the darkness and rain. They were strong, independent, capable of confronting the elements, and she was just a fragile girl, unable even to help. At this moment, as despair reached its peak, something inside Evelyn changed. She remembered her mother's words, which she often repeated. Even the smallest seed can grow into a mighty tree if given a chance. She clutched the Bible in her hand, feeling the solid shape of the dried cherry blossom under her fingers. What if her uselessness was just an illusion she had created for herself? What if she was capable of more than just waiting and trembling with fear? She looked at the burning hearth, at the walls of the house, at the things she could do. She couldn't fix the windmill, but she could take care of the house, the livestock, of what was within her power. Her gaze fell on the table, where a map of the surrounding area lay, which Jonathan had left after dinner. She had never paid attention to it, but now she saw marks on it, indicating other water sources. Not far from the ranch, marked by a barely visible dot, was an old, abandoned well. Jonathan had probably forgotten about it, or considered it too dirty. But what if? An epiphany struck her, like lightning tearing through the stormy sky. She couldn't fix the windmill, but she could find water. She could do what no one else expected of her. In her heart, through pain and despair, a thin sprout of hope mixed with determination broke through. She straightened up. Her face, so recently distorted by fear, was now full of firm resolve. She would not let herself be broken. She would find her way, and she would prove to everyone that she was capable of more than just being an assistant. She would live. The night was still young, but the storm was already moving east, leaving behind damp air and an ominous silence. Evelyn's heart pounded like a trapped burr, but the fear that had gripped her moments before gave way to a new, burning resolve. She grabbed an old lantern, a flask with remnants of water standing by the door, and a heavy crowbar that Silas used for small tasks. Her ankle throbbed with a dull ache, but she ignored it. Every step was dictated by a single thought: find water. The map, on which Jonathan had once carelessly marked an old well, now seemed like a treasure. Leaving the house, Evelyn plunged into almost complete darkness. Only sparse stars pierced through the remaining clouds, casting a ghostly light on the wet prairie. The path to the well, indicated on the map, turned out to be merely a faint rut, overgrown with tall grass and bushes. The rain had turned the ground into a slippery mess, and every step was difficult. The cold wind bit to the bone, and the trees, creaking and groaning, seemed to whisper warnings. Several times she stumbled, nearly falling, but she held tightly to the crowbar, which now served as her support. After a long, strenuous half-hour, When her lungs were already burning from the effort, Evelyn finally saw the outline of the old well. It stood on a small hill, surrounded by a dilapidated wooden log frame, appearing as a lonely ghost in the night's gloom. Rotted planks, a collapsed roof, everything spoke of long years of neglect. She approached closer, and her heart sank with disappointment. The bucket, apparently once attached to a rope, lay to the side, broken in half. The winch was broken, and the rope, if there even was one, had long rotted away. The well was filled with stones and debris, but through the cracks, she discerned a faint but clear gleam of water deep below. The water was there, but how to get it out? Despair again rose to her throat, threatening to choke her. She had come all this way, overcoming pain and fear, only to find her hope shattered again. But then her gaze fell on a sturdy, long tree branch, broken off by the storm and lying nearby. An idea sparked in her mind. With difficulty, overcoming the pain in her ankle, she dragged the branch to the well. It was long enough to reach the water, but how to hook something with it to lift the water? A memory flashed in her mind of old abandoned farms in Idaho, where peasants used something similar to draw water. She saw a rusty but strong piece of wire in the grass, which might have once been used for tying livestock. Clumsily, with fingers trembling from the cold, Evelyn began to bend the wire, trying to form a hook. It was a slow, exhausting job her numb fingers barely obeyed. But she didn't give up. She worked like a woman possessed, forgetting the pain, the cold, the fear. Each time the wire slipped from her hands, she started anew, her resolve only strengthening. After what seemed like an eternity, she managed to create a makeshift hook. She tied it to the branch, and then carefully lowered the branch into the well. At first, nothing happened. The hook slipped, the water barely visible. But then, after dozens of attempts, she felt resistance. She pulled with all her might, her muscles burning, but she didn't retreat. Slowly, inch by inch, she pulled out the branch, and attached to it was an old, half-rotted wooden bucket, almost full of clean, icy water. It was like a miracle. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of despair, but of pure triumph. She had done it. She had found water. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Jonathan and Silas were returning from the broken windmill. Their faces were grim. Repairs required not only a trip to town for parts, but also time they didn't have. Water was running out, and the livestock were beginning to suffer. Jonathan tiredly, "No luck." Silas, "No parts, we'll have to wait a week." "And the water." Silas sighing, "Then we'll have to drive the cattle to the river. It's far and dangerous." At that moment, Evelyn's figure emerged from the darkness. She was limping, but in her hands, she carried a bucket brimmed with water. Her face was smeared with dirt, her hair disheveled, but her eyes shone with an extraordinary light. Jonathan and Silas froze, rooted to the spot. They couldn't believe their eyes. Evelyn, her voice was hoarse, but she spoke proudly. I found water. In the old well." Jonathan was the first to recover. He ran to her, took the bucket, and drank greedily. Then he looked at Evelyn. In his eyes, there was not only relief but also deep respect. He saw not just a girl he had saved from slavery, but a strong, courageous woman who had found a way out of a hopeless situation. Silas, usually unflappable, merely shook his head. Silas, smiling, "Well, I'll be. And I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. Good job, girl." The next morning, Silver Creek Ranch came back to life. The water from the old well, though obtained with difficulty, saved the livestock. Evelyn, despite the pain in her leg, continued to fetch water every day, while Jonathan and Silas began to restore the well. They repaired the winch, fixed the log frame, and soon the well became a reliable source of water. Evelyn no longer felt like a useless burden. She became part of the ranch, an integral part of its life. Years passed. Silver Creek Ranch prospered. Evelyn, no longer a 16-year-old girl, but a mature woman, managed all the household chores and sometimes even helped Jonathan with documents and calculations. Her hands were no longer chapped by caustic soap, but they retained their strength and confidence. The deep wrinkles around her eyes smoothed out, replaced by soft lines that appeared with frequent, genuine smiles. The dried cherry blossom branch from the Bible, once a symbol of loss, now lay on a shelf in her room, next to a photograph of Jonathan, Silas, and Evelyn herself, taken by the town photographer. It was a reminder of the journey she had traveled. Jonathan Reed, whose hair was now completely gray but whose eyes retained their former kindness, often watched Evelyn. He saw her laugh, how she directed the workers, how she cared for every detail on the ranch. He realized that he had found not just an assistant, but a true partner. A woman who had brought light into his solitary life. His own infertility, once seemingly a condemnation, no longer mattered. He had found not just a family, but a deep, unwavering meaning in his life which had once seemed empty. A meaning given to him by this fragile, but incredibly strong girl. And at that moment, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset over the prairie, he understood that his life, full of loss and loneliness, had finally found harmony. He was happy. Conclusion. The story of Evelyn and Jonathan reminds us that a person's true worth is not defined by their origin, status, or physical abilities. In a modern world full of fleeting judgments and prejudices, we often forget that each of us possesses an inner strength capable of overcoming any difficulty. Evelyn, rejected and humiliated, found the resolve to fight and prove her worth, while Jonathan, despite his personal tragedy, opened his heart to another person. This story teaches us not to give up in the face of adversity, to believe in ourselves, and most importantly, to see the true beauty and strength in every person, regardless of their shortcomings or past mistakes.